It starts quietly, not with a fight, not with a scream, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles between you and your parents. Invisible, but heavy. It begins when you learn that some emotions aren't safe to share. Maybe it was that one time you cried and someone said, "Stop being so dramatic," or the day you tried to open up but the response was, "You're overthinking it." That's when your mind took its first note. My feelings cause discomfort. So you learn to swallow them. Psychologists call this emotional inhibition, the tendency to suppress feelings to avoid conflict or rejection. Children don't do it consciously. They adapt. They read faces, tones, silences, and adjust to survive in emotional climates that don't feel safe. And slowly your body learns a language your voice never got to speak. You smile when you're sad. You laugh when you're hurt. You nod when you want to scream. Because somewhere along the way, you decided that peace, even false peace, was safer than truth. When we talk about hiding pain from parents, we're not talking about lies. We're talking about protection. A child protecting their parent from disappointment. A son protecting his father's pride. A daughter protecting her mother's worry. You start believing that your pain will become their burden, so you carry it quietly. In psychology, this is called role reversal. When children internalize responsibility for their parents' emotions, it sounds subtle, but it shapes entire lives. You stop expressing need because you don't want to add weight. You become the caretaker, the strong one, the "it's fine" person. But inside, you're aching for someone to ask, "Are you really okay?" And when no one does, you tell yourself they wouldn't understand anyway. The truth is, you've rehearsed the disappointment before it even happens. You picture their faces, their confusion, their guilt. So you save them from it. And in that act of protection, you distance yourself from the very people you wish would notice. There's a concept in developmental psychology called attachment adaptation. It explains how children modify their emotional expression based on what feels acceptable in their family. If love was conditional, based on behavior, achievement, or emotional control. You learn to present only the parts of yourself that feel lovable. You hide your anger because it feels disrespectful. You hide your sadness because it feels weak. You hide your fear because it feels inconvenient. And one day, hiding becomes your default. Not a choice, a reflex. You stop even realizing you're doing it. When pain comes, you smile through it. When you break down, you do it behind closed doors. You become fluent in silence, an expert in pretending everything's fine. But beneath that composure lives a quiet longing to be seen without having to explain yourself. Psychologists say that children raised in emotionally restrained homes often develop what's known as alexithymia, difficulty identifying and expressing emotions. Not because they lack feelings, but because they were never given the language or space to express them safely. So when you grow up, your sadness feels like static, your anger becomes exhaustion, and your need for love feels like guilt. You hide your pain because you've never learned how to show it safely, because vulnerability once meant danger, not connection. Here's the paradox. Even though you hide your pain to protect your parents, a part of you secretly wishes they'd notice anyway. That they'd look into your eyes and see the fatigue behind your smile. That they'd understand your silence isn't defiance, it's defense. That they'd say, "You don't have to be strong all the time." But most parents can't read that silence. They see independence where there's actually loneliness. They see resilience where there's actually suppression. And so the cycle continues, both sides loving each other quietly, never realizing that love without expression feels a lot like distance. Pain unspoken doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes overthinking, perfectionism, people-pleasing, or burnout. It hides in your achievements, in your calmness, in your "I'm okay." Your brain learns that being seen equals being unsafe, and so it keeps you invisible, even when you're desperate to be found. That's not weakness, that's conditioning. A nervous system that once learned, "My truth is too heavy for the people I love," and that belief, quietly, builds the wall you still live behind. But walls, even emotional ones, aren't built overnight. They start with small bricks, moments you barely notice, when your tears annoyed someone, when your vulnerability met silence, When your parents' exhaustion taught you that love was best expressed in sacrifice, not softness. You don't resent them for it. You understand they were surviving too. Maybe they were never taught how to hold pain gently, theirs or yours, and so it passes down one generation learning to hide, the next inheriting the silence. But here's where healing begins. When you stop blaming and start understanding. When you realize hiding your pain wasn't a flaw, it was an act of love born in fear. The fear of being a burden, the fear of not being understood, the fear of breaking the illusion of everything's fine. You grow older and people start saying things like, "You've changed. You're so calm. You're so mature for your age." They say it like a compliment. But you know it's not calm, it's control. It's what happens when you've spent years keeping chaos under your ribs. You've learned how to smile with restraint, how to speak without trembling, how to cry in silence so no one hears. Psychologists call this emotional suppression, and over time it reshapes the nervous system. When emotions are consistently avoided, the body doesn't just forget, it adapts. The stress hormones stay slightly elevated, the muscles stay slightly tense, the heart learns to beat quietly, even when it's breaking. That's the hidden cost of hiding pain. Your body starts carrying what your voice cannot. Maybe you've noticed it. The headaches that come out of nowhere, the tightness in your chest when someone asks if you're okay, the exhaustion that hits even when you've done nothing all day. It's not weakness, it's unspoken emotion turned physical. The body remembers everything the mind avoids. Trauma researchers like Dr. Bessel van der Kolk describe this as somatic memory. The idea that pain stored emotionally can find its way into the body's tissues and reflexes. So even when you tell yourself, "It's fine," your body whispers, "It's not." That's why sometimes when your parent simply asks, "What's wrong?" your throat tightens before you even speak, because it remembers the last time it wasn't safe to answer honestly. Over time, something subtle happens. You begin to lose access to your own emotions, not because they're gone, but because they've been buried too deep. You stop recognizing the difference between "I'm tired" and "I'm sad," between "I'm fine" and "I'm numb. Psychologists call this emotional detachment, a coping mechanism that develops when expression feels too risky. It protects you from pain, yes, but it also isolates you from connection, because how can anyone reach you if you no longer know how to let them in? You start becoming the strong one in every room, the one people go to for advice, for calm, for steadiness. But no one asks you when the last time was that you felt safe crying. There's an invisible exhaustion in that role, a quiet kind of burnout that doesn't come from work. It comes from constantly managing your emotions so others don't have to. Psychologists refer to it as emotional labor, and in families it often begins in childhood. You learn to soothe your parents' anger, to comfort their sadness, and to anticipate their needs before they're spoken. At first it feels like love. Later it starts to feel like disappearing, because when you spend your life managing other people's emotions, you forget you were ever allowed to have your own. Sometimes you catch yourself wanting to tell them, to just say, "Mom, I'm not as strong as you think. Dad, sometimes I'm scared of disappointing you." But the words dissolve before they reach your tongue. Because you already know the script, you can hear the responses before they happen. Don't think too much. You're fine. Just focus on your work. And so you go quiet again. Because sometimes silence feels less painful than being misunderstood. That's the real heartbreak. Not that they don't care, but that they don't know how to hear you. Research in family psychology shows that many parents interpret a child's emotional honesty as failure, a reflection of their own inadequacy. So they defend, they dismiss, they minimize, not to hurt you, but to protect themselves. And in that defense, they lose connection. You both do. You start noticing it more as you grow. The conversations that never go beyond "How was your day?" The way they talk about everything except what matters. The way your love for them is tangled with quiet resentment, for never asking, for never seeing. But deep down, you know they carry their own silence too. Your father hides his exhaustion behind advice. Your mother hides her fear behind control. They learned to survive the same way you did, by pretending it didn't hurt. That realization doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it context. You start to see that emotional distance in families isn't built from lack of love. It's built from fear. Fear of weakness, fear of burden, fear of breaking a cycle no one knows how to end. And so you keep living half-truths, telling them you're okay, smiling when you're not, sharing your successes but hiding your struggles. It's not deceit, it's self-preservation. It's the mind saying, if they don't see my pain, they can't reject it. But each time you hide it, you lose a little more of yourself. You start living not as who you are, but as who you think they can handle. You become a performance dash dash, polished, calm, collected, while your inner world hums with unspoken storms. Here's what psychology teaches us about that. When emotions are suppressed long enough, they don't disappear. They leak. Through irritability, detachment, overachievement, or numbness. You start to confuse control with peace and avoidance with strength. You tell yourself you're fine because you're functional, but inside you're starving for emotional intimacy. The kind where someone simply says, I see you. That hunger doesn't always show up as sadness. Sometimes it appears as perfectionism. The constant need to prove yourself, to be flawless, to never disappoint. Because if you can be perfect, maybe you'll finally be safe enough to be real. But perfection doesn't buy love. It only postpones honesty. And the longer you perform, the more foreign your own emotions start to feel. You forget what crying freely feels like. You forget that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's truth. You forget that being loved for your composure isn't the same as being loved for who you are. And then one day, you wake up and realize you've built your entire identity around being okay. Healing doesn't start with confrontation, it starts with awareness. You can't force yourself to open up. You can only understand why you closed in the first place. That's what psychologists call emotional awareness, the bridge between suppression and expression. It's the moment you realize that hiding your pain didn't make you weak, it made you adapted. And adaptation is intelligence, the kind that kept you safe when honesty didn't. But now, you're older, and safety looks different. It's no longer about protecting your parents from pain. It's about protecting your connection with yourself. The first step is to notice. Notice how you flinch when someone asks if you're okay. Notice the small pauses before you say, I'm fine. Notice how your voice tightens when a parent says, don't worry about us. Those tiny hesitations are echoes of every moment you felt unseen, and every time you notice them, you pull another thread from the web of silence that's held you for years. Healing happens in these micro moments, not in grand breakthroughs, but in quiet realizations. When you finally whisper to yourself, I do hide, but I don't want to anymore. Psychologists say that re-establishing emotional connection with family requires what's called corrective emotional experience. It means creating a new outcome in a familiar emotional situation. For example, instead of shutting down when your mother asks how you're doing, you take a small breath and you say something real. Maybe not everything, just enough to test the safety again. It might sound like, I've been tired lately, or things feel heavy but I'm managing. Small, honest fragments, because authenticity doesn't return all at once. It returns in pieces that slowly reteach your brain that honesty can coexist with safety. And the beauty is, sometimes they surprise you. Sometimes they listen, not perfectly, not with the right words, but with something gentler, attention. A moment of stillness that says, I may not understand everything, but I care. That's where reconnection begins, not in flawless communication, but in mutual imperfection. Still, there's another side to this, acceptance, because some parents will never learn the language of emotion the way you need them to. Not because they don't love you, but because they were never taught how to love in that language. And that's one of the hardest truths to face. Healing might not come from the apology you want, but from the understanding you give. Psychologists call this reparenting yourself, becoming the adult who gives your younger self what your parents couldn't. It's not rebellion, it's repair. When you start comforting yourself instead of criticizing, listening to your feelings instead of silencing them, you begin rewriting your internal script. You stop waiting to be seen and start seeing yourself. Sometimes that means crying in private, not out of loneliness, but out of release. Sometimes it means telling your parent a small truth, knowing they might not respond perfectly, and being okay with that. Because the goal isn't to make them understand everything. The goal is to stop shrinking who you are in the hope that they will. The child in you hid pain to keep love. The adult in you can share pain to deepen it. There's a psychological term for what happens when someone finally speaks their truth after years of silence. Effective release. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, like air leaving lungs after being held too long. It's the nervous system learning that honesty no longer equals danger. When that happens, even in small ways, you begin to notice something extraordinary. You feel lighter, not because the pain vanished, but because it finally has somewhere to go. And slowly, the walls soften. You find yourself having conversations that once felt impossible. You find yourself saying things like, "I don't always know how to talk about my feelings." And instead of shame, you feel relief. You realize that communication doesn't need to be perfect to be healing. It just needs to be real. Over time, that truth seeps into other parts of your life. You start choosing relationships where you can be transparent. You start expressing emotion without apologizing for it. You stop editing your sadness to make others comfortable. Because you've learned that your feelings were never a burden. They were a bridge waiting to be crossed. You might still hide sometimes. Old habits don't vanish, they fade. But now, when you do, you notice. You smile gently at yourself and think, "It's okay. I used to need this to survive." That's self-compassion, the quiet voice that replaces shame with understanding. And maybe one day, when your parent calls and asks, "How are you?" you'll pause for just a moment longer than usual, and you'll answer truthfully. Maybe not completely, but truthfully enough. And that small act, that small honesty, will be the sound of the cycle breaking, because hiding pain once kept you safe, but showing it, even softly, is what makes you whole. It's what transforms love from duty into understanding, from distance into connection, from silence into peace. And that peace, the one you've been protecting everyone else from, is finally yours to feel.